Tonight we also have a fascinating topic, of course, looking ahead at American foreign policy. And we're so fortunate to have doing that looking for us someone also very well known to all of you, who first addressed this council, by the way, almost 3 decades ago in the late 1980s on U.S. trade at that time, just after he was elected to the Congress of the United States. So we have nice memories of his several presentations here, 8 to be exact. Yeah. But as you all now know, he's a senior member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That means ranking Democrat. And who knows how the elections are going to go in the Senate in the fall. But if you want to look ahead, he's one of the few men in the country who's in a position whose vision you would really appreciate. So we're absolutely delighted that he's addressing us and that topic this evening. Senator Cardin enjoys a wonderful reputation in Maryland, as all of us know, for his conscientiousness, his diligence, his faith in the country, and his integrity. As you all know, he graduated first in his law school from the University of Maryland Law and served in the United States Congress shortly after that graduation. I should say that he didn't serve first in the Congress, he served in the House of Delegates, rising to the speakership. Then went into the House after 2 decades in the House of Delegates. And in the career, both there and now in the U.S. Congress, he's been known for great attention to a variety of issues of great interest to the entire citizenry of the state, whether it be the centerpiece of the Chesapeake, whether it be health care matters, whether it be retirement issues, whether it be economic issues. He has always looked at the things that are very meaningful to the general population. Now, of course, and this evening, it's his interest in foreign affairs which draws our attention. He was elected to the Senate after serving the House for 2 decades about 10 years ago. He's had an interest in the Helsinki Commission, though, since 1993, again when he had just gone into the House. He's been an active member of it. He's chaired the U.S. Commission twice, I believe, and he remains active in it. And that underlines his interest in human rights as well as security concerns. And we all know that the Magnitsky affair of a couple of years ago was something in which he took a verbal interest and also influenced legislation on the matter. But his assignments have been not just focusing on human rights, of course. He's one time chaired the Africa Subcommittee. I think he still serves on it. He's the present chair of the East Asia Subcommittee. He's been on the Cyber Security Subcommittee. And as I said, he currently is the senior Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. As you look at our perplexing primaries of today, and you try to exaggerate the natural dissonance after an election in a democratic society where there are a lot of losers. We may have all losers this time, but it's hard to keep the ship steered correctly in those circumstances. And Senator Cardin's reputation for even-handedness, great commitment to the nation, conscious of the national interest, and a willingness to discuss things openly with everyone makes him, I think, not only the kind of personality which the nation needs at this time when we look forward to dissonance, but the kind of person we really are delighted to have in a leadership position. So it's a great privilege and an honor to present Senator Ben Cardin.
Dr. Byrd, thank you for that very generous introduction. As you went through all the different positions that I've held, it looks like I can't keep a job for very long. So that was, and I survived 8 appearances here. I didn't realize there had been 8 times. And this is a tough audience. So but now you're all saying no. It's great to be here, and it's great to be back. And I'm very proud of what the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs has meant for our region. a sophisticated discussion on foreign policy. And I'm always very impressed by the number of people that are interested in foreign policy. I've been told that if you want to do well in politics, pay attention to the local economic issues. But you all have disproved that by showing that we have a great interest and thirst for foreign policy here in our region, and we're very proud of that. I'm joined by my wife, Myrna, and I told her I would take her out for dinner, so this was a chance to bring her here and talk about some of their issues. I didn't tell her how many people would be here, but anyway, it really is great. And of course, we're going to talk about foreign policy, looking ahead. And I don't know why I chose that subject, looking at the presidential, what's been going on there. We could have a field day with some of the comments that have been made on foreign policy. But I think we are at a critical moment in America's history. And this election, of course, is going to be a defining election. I've been asked, just to give you an example of how bizarre things are. Myrna and I were in the southern part of Africa, in Zimbabwe, meeting with Robert Mugabe, who is the longtime dictator of that country. He's been there for longer than I've been coming to these meetings. He's been president of Zimbabwe. And we start with a whole list of issues we want to take up with him on human rights and governance. And all he wants to do is talk about the U.S. presidential election. So we are the conversation of the world today. And it's good that we can have this discussion tonight. So I also want to introduce to you Aljean Sajari of my office, who's on the Foreign Relations Committee. She's been an expert on a lot of these foreign policy matters. If you really do get too detailed, I might just have to turn it over to Aljean and let her answer some of the questions tonight. I'm also joined by Sean Bartlett, who's on Senate Foreign Relations staff, and Marty Walsh, who's somewhere around here, but he's roaming. So I mention that because these people are really dedicated people in foreign policy. It's incredible, the challenges around the world today. And since I've taken on the responsibilities as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, any given day, we could be talking about a problem anywhere in the world, and there's always going to be problems around the world. So I thank the staff for their dedication to deal with these issues. Looking forward to foreign policy, let me first acknowledge that the Obama administration has had a very impressive record of accomplishments in foreign policy. And I've been proud to be part of the efforts. We try to work together, the Congress and the President, on foreign policy. And I can tell you, Chairman Corker, the Republican chairman of our committee, we really do work without partisan politics on 95% of what we do in our committee, which I think is a pretty good record. And I think most objective observers would give the President very high marks in what he's been able to achieve in his presidency on foreign policy. We were engaged in two wars when he took office, in Iraq and Afghanistan, one that we should not have been engaged in my view, the Iraq War. And the President was able to bring our ground troops out of both of those conflicts. One is pretty well finished. The other is still being waged, but with special forces and tactical support more so than with ground troops. So the President's been able to disengage our military from the primary roles that it was playing in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's been able to forge international coalitions, which is, to me, extremely important. As a result, he's been successful in our war against terror, in that we have taken out many of the top leaders, including, of course, Osama bin Laden. And he has been able to regain, the United States, through our efforts with our coalition partners, be able to regain a lot of territory that were held and controlled by terrorist organizations. The President, in our own hemisphere, reversed a policy that had been in place for decades and not working in a new relationship with Cuba. And the strategies are working, and we are now in a different position in our own hemisphere. It affects not only Cuba, but our relationship with countries in this hemisphere, which we had a strained relationship before the President announced the new policy in regards to Cuba. And we've had a strategic pivot in both Asia and Africa while maintaining a strong partnership, traditional partnership with our European allies. So the President's been able to accomplish some really good things. In Central America, he has concentrated on trying to develop good governance in countries using the Plan Colombia model to deal with problems in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala, to show our interest to deal with the unaccompanied children, but also to deal with the problems of gang violence in our own hemisphere. And then, just recently, I think the President accomplished one of the great accomplishments of our time, and that is what was accomplished in Paris in COP21, the Global Climate Agreement. We had a climate summit today. It started at College Park. It will continue tomorrow in Washington, where world leaders will come to the United States to follow up the climate change discussions in Paris. The President, through his leadership, was able to develop a strategy where we could bring 196 countries together, all the major emitters of greenhouse gases, to a strategy that has us all responsible to do something about climate change. And we tried this many times before and didn't succeed. And under President Obama's leadership, in working with leaders of other countries, a framework was developed that we could move forward. And we call this climate diplomacy. This is a major issue in foreign policy. I could go through all the different reasons why, but I think you all understand the environmental risks that we're suffering. You understand the impact it has on the Chesapeake Bay. Myrna and I were, when we were in the southern part of Africa, had a chance to look at, from the air, what was happening in that part of the world. Africa, southern part of Africa, has two seasons. They have a dry season and they have a rainy season. Well, for the last 2 years, they've only had one season, and that's the dry season. And we flew over lakes that had no water in it and saw how life was being challenged because of the impact of climate change. So this is a matter of incredibly important foreign policy. We believe that our foreign policy toolbox includes not only our soldiers, but also development assistance and diplomacy. And if we're trying to get sustainable economies, the climate change has made it much more challenging. We know that, that climate refugees will add to the impact of whether we can have stable countries. So this affects our world stability. And the President was able to move forward with a policy that will hopefully get us moving in the right direction. I was in Paris. I took 9 of my colleagues. I led a delegation to express our support for what the President was doing. And sometimes we're asked, well, how about all that dissent in Congress? Well, 10 of us showed up in support. None of the senators who opposed it went to Paris. They may, in some cases, have more in number, but we have more in intensity to make sure that we move forward on the climate agenda. But just as importantly as the individual accomplishments that President Obama has been able to achieve, it's been the principles that he has advanced to me that will be the lasting legacy. And those principles, including, as I mentioned earlier, working with our international partners in coalition building. Coalition building can take time. Americans usually don't have patience, but it takes time. And in working with our coalition partners, we have a lot more credibility in what we do internationally. We can be a lot more effective, and we can have a much more lasting impact. So let me just give you one example, because it's not without controversy, and that is our foreign policy activities in Ukraine after the Russian takeover of Crimea and what's going on in eastern Ukraine. The United States worked with our coalition partners. President Obama moved with Europe. And quite frankly, many of us thought that the United States should have moved more aggressively in a more military presence. And maybe if we acted alone, we would have. But we needed Europe. Why did we need Europe? Because if we're going to be able to impose effective sanctions and isolate Russia, you only can do that if you have Europe on your side. And we do have Europe on our side. And we don't always get everything we want when we work in coalitions, but we can be more effective. And President Obama, I think, has really advanced that to a point that has made a huge difference in U.S. effectiveness of U.S. foreign policy. So I strongly disagree with those who say that the United States should go it alone, or that we should, the world should be damned, or we should, that NATO no longer has any relevancy. I think those coalitions are critically important, and President Obama's establishment of coalition building, I think, will have a lasting impact. And I hope the days are gone when we use our cowboy diplomacy, where we believe that we can handle everything by the use of our military. We're living in an increasingly complex and unpredictable world, and I believe it is that the sustained engagement and smart diplomacy of the United States that can and will provide the stability that we need internationally. As I said, our national security budget, and it was Secretary of State Clinton who initiated the term that our national security budget includes more than Department of Defense, our guns and soldiers, but also includes the Department of State and our budget for diplomacy and development assistance. And Secretary Clinton was correct in that, so that the use of force should be the last resort, not the first resort. And I believe President Obama has established that as the right principle in our country. So I strongly disagree with those, and this person wanted to become president of the United States, our commander-in-chief, at least until earlier today, when he said we will carpet bomb them into oblivion. I don't know if sands can glow in the dark, but we're going to find out. I disagree with those types of statements. And President Obama disagreed with those types of statements. And thank goodness, I think the American people understand the risks involved by trying to lead with force. And a key measure of our foreign policy must be the progress we're making on non-proliferation, particularly weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. And President Obama, I think, has done a very strong record moving in the direction of non-proliferation. These are principles that will hold us well. But let me go over where I hope we will learn from some of the shortcomings of our foreign policy endeavors. Because not everything has been done right, and I think we need to learn from the mistakes that we have made. And one of those mistakes that we have made, in my view, and the Obama administration has compounded that, is to look to the 2001 Congressional Act on the authorization on the use of military force that was passed right after the attack on our country of 9/11. Congress passed it, and we passed it because of the attack on our country that was used for our military action in Afghanistan, which was appropriate, Under the Constitution, it's only the Congress that can authorize the sustained use of our military, the declaration of war. And we clarified that through the War Powers Act that requires congressional action if we're going to keep a sustained military force in a country. Well, that 2001 authorization for force was worded in a way that gave the president the authority to go after the bad guys that attacked our country. And the Obama administration has interpreted that to mean ISIL, even though ISIL didn't exist on 9/11. So the president has used the authority under the act that Congress passed to go after the al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan. He has now used that to go after the ISIL forces in Syria and Libya and other countries in which ISIL affiliates are operating. Now, I trust President Obama's judgment on the use of military force, but it's the Congress's responsibility to authorize that use of force. And the president has made it clear that he won't bring in ground troops. He's made that pretty clear. But the next president, or the president after the next president, could very well interpret and use that authority to not only interject our air support just about anywhere in the world, but to introduce American ground troops under the authority based upon the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. So I am disappointed that there wasn't stronger efforts made to get an ISIL-specific authorization for the use of military force passed, so the president had from Congress everything he needed to conduct this military operation, which in my view would have restricted ground troops, and sunsetted the 2001, taking it out off the books so that it's not available to the next president of the United States or any future president of the United States, because there is no limit on time on the 2001 authorization, and that authorization could be used indefinitely. Another one of my concerns about what has happened during the Obama administration is that the predictability of U.S. engagement. Our allies really depend upon knowing that if we say we're going to be there, America's there. We are the strongest military force in the world, and the trade-off for their giving up, arming themselves, or creating a larger military or moving towards nuclear weapons is the fact that they believe America will be there to protect their interests in that region. They need a reliable partner. But when President Obama drew a red line on the president of Syria, Assad, using chemical weapons would draw a military response from the United States. And then we crossed that red line without military action being taken. It affected the credibility of America and whether we could be counted as a predictable ally. Now, it so happened that the president made the right policy judgment. We got rid of the chemical weapons much more effectively through diplomacy than we ever could have through a military action. That's a fact. The policy was right. He never should have drawn that red line. And we don't know what that has caused. So you can't equate that. But I am convinced it was in the equation of Mr. Putin and Russia as he plotted his activities in Ukraine or decided to interject his military into Syria. And I am convinced it's in the equation that President Xi of China has used in his military operations in the China Sea, recognizing that the likelihood of a military response, which would have to come from the United States, is much less. That's just my assessment. Foreign policy, we must be predictable. Yes, I disagree with another person who's running for president who says America should be unpredictable. To me, that's just absolutely wrong. We need to have predictable foreign policy. I mention all this because we want to make sure that we learn from how we have developed in foreign policy. Let me mention just one other issue that I think has me of great concern. And that really dates back to our campaign in Iraq. I was opposed to it. I don't believe we should have interjected our military into Iraq after 9/11. There was no evidence that they were involved in the attack on our country. And as it was shown, there was no weapons of mass destruction. But once we got engaged in Iraq, once we were able to resolve the military issues in Iraq, we needed to make sure that there was a stable government in Iraq to be able to maintain the stability in that country. You can't just go in there and shake things up and expect when you leave things are going to be hunky-dory. You've got to be able to invest in developing good governance in that country. And we didn't. And as a result, we had many communities that did not feel safe. We had Sunni majority communities who felt that the Shia militia would not be a safe keeper for their security, and they were right. And there was not the central government's commitment to all the people of Iraq. Well, you can't blame President Obama for the military activities in Iraq, but the Obama administration was involved in a military operation in Libya. And I think most of us felt that the timing was right for military intervention in Libya. But when we left conflicting parties of power that could not get themselves together, leaving a vacuum in which ISIL now is operating in Libya. We've got to be able to have a blueprint on what is going to happen after we intervene in these countries, before we intervene in these countries. And I hope that's the lesson that we've learned from those activities. But let me move towards what I think is the most fundamental issue in foreign policy that affects all of our abilities to accomplish all of our missions. It's an issue that President Obama advanced and, at a very high level during his presidency. He's continuing to advance it. And it will be the priority that I will promote as the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It should come to no surprise to Dr. Byrd and others that are here. For it is good governance, it is human rights, it is a government that protects the rights of all of its people. It's a government that allows for dissent without arresting the people who disagree with you. It's a government that respects religious freedom. It's a government that allows the press to report on what is happening. It's a government that encourages free and fair elections. In other words, it's good governance. It's a government that can have the confidence of all of its people. And that's what I think needs to be fundamental in how we develop foreign policy moving forward. To me, it's got to be our highest priority. I have been involved in that in the Helsinki Commission. The Helsinki Commission, as I think most of you know, operates for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, has 3 baskets. It's best known for its human rights. But the principles of Helsinki is that a country will not be secure. Yes, you have to be able to defend your borders. You must have your military capability of defending yourself. But you'll never be secure unless you have economic opportunity for all of your citizens and you respect the human rights of all the citizens. And that's proven over and over and over again. That's been my experience, and it's true today as it was before. Let me just give you one example from that, and that is the current situation in Ukraine. Again, I'll come back to Ukraine. Make no mistake about it, the culprit in Ukraine for what's going on today is Russia. They have violated just about every international principle that they have signed off. They violated every single one of the core principles of Helsinki. They violated international agreements that they entered into. They are currently in Crimea, which belongs to Ukraine, and they are, their troops and their advisors are very much involved in what's going on in the eastern part of Ukraine. But I'll tell you this. I was in Kyiv during right after the second protests, and I was there to observe the elections. And what happened in the Maidan, what happened in the square, what happened in the uprising, had little to do with the politics of the East and West. It had just about everything to do with the people of Ukraine tired of corrupt government. They wanted to be treated fairly. They were tired of paying a bribe in order to get their children into a school. They were tired of paying a bribe in order to be able to get a license. They wanted an honest government. And Ukraine today is not an honest government. They're not there. They still have the prosecutor just resigned, which is a good thing, because he was an arm of the government rather than being an independent prosecutor. And Ukraine's success, yes, we've got to protect them from Russia, but their success will only be assured if the leaders of Ukraine embrace the principles of good governance. And we're going to continue to raise those issues over and over again. It's also, by the way, the key to the success in Syria. Syria is obviously is a country in which we do not have a game plan yet where we can see a light at the end of the tunnel. With the civil war that's taken place in that country between the Assad forces and opposition has created an international crisis. And then ISIL has been very active in Syria as well as in Iraq and other countries. What that has caused is an international humanitarian crisis. The number of refugees that have left Syria simply because they want to live and they want to have a future for their children because of what's happening in Syria. And we need to deal with the humanitarian crisis. But it's also having, or the individuals, but it's also having an impact on the surrounding countries. There are countries that surround Syria that have 1 million Syrian refugees in it. That obviously affects the stability of that country. And now we're seeing in Europe being challenged. So it's in our national security interest to figure out how to deal with these things, in addition to our humanitarian concerns of what happens in Syria. But the problem in Syria is that you have a void. You've got warring factions in which ISIL, an extremist group, can find recruits. The Washington Post wrote on April the 12th, because if you think this is a religious reason that the fighters are joining ISIL, I urge you to take a look at this, because that's not what the facts on the ground are showing. Facts on the ground are showing, and I'm quoting from the Washington Post, religious fervor plays a secondary role at best. When young Arabs do decide to sign up with the Islamic State, participants listed joblessness and poor economic prospect as the top reason. If we can't deal with economic opportunity in Syria, if we can't get good governance, we're not going to be able to block ISIL. We're not going to be able to have a stable country. So you need to have good governance. It's very interesting. Myrna and I were very recently in Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the region. We had a chance to meet with the king of Saudi Arabia, the kingdom. We met with the emir, the head of Qatar, and we asked both the same question. And that question was basically, if they both said, number one, resolving Syria, got to get rid of Assad, President Assad. That he's got blood on his hands, he has no credibility, he's got to go. I happen to agree with them on that point. I don't think President Assad should be in The Hague. So he should not be in Damascus. I agree with that assessment. But we then asked, well, now, as you know, Qatar and Saudi Arabia are dominant Sunni countries. We asked, well, now suppose a person from the Shiite community becomes the leader of Syria. Will that be okay for you? And both said without any hesitation, it says it makes no difference what religion they come from or what sect they come from. It's whether they'll represent all the people of Syria in a non-sectarian manner so that all communities are safe and we don't have the threat of instability. The Saudis are very concerned about the instability in the region coming into their country, and they have reason to be concerned about that. So good governance is the key to beating ISIL. It's the key for resolving the problems in Syria. And that's why we put so much attention on good governance, so much attention. The byproduct of good governance is that we can have governments that can provide for the needs of their people. We know that in these health crises that we've seen in countries, those countries that have good governance are able to deal with that. We were in Namibia, and we visited an AIDS clinic. And we saw a whole generation of people that are alive today that wouldn't have been alive. And they thanked us for our help in that regard. But Namibia has governance that can at least deal with that in a fair manner so they can deal with the next pandemic. And we don't know what that's going to be. These are some of the side benefits. And as we know, if you can't deal with the health, you can't deal with the basic services, you're not going to be able to deal with the stability in the country. I believe there's a common thread woven through much of the world's ills and crisis in government and an overt willingness to ignore the rule of law. We can look at examples of when we've entered into major global agreements and implemented strong governance standards. The Marshall Plan, the Helsinki Accords come to mind. For too long, in my estimation, the United States foreign policy has treated governance issues as an afterthought, as a secondary priority. It's got to be a top priority. Corruption is a plague. It pervades governments, creates economic and political instability, threatens the impact of foreign aid, and damages investment opportunities. We must do better. Our approach on these issues need to be mainstream and centralized to our foreign and national security policy. They can no longer be viewed as ancillary or nice to have. In fact, I believe governance agenda, how it's implemented and carried out, can be the catalytic element for success in our foreign policy and national security objectives that we seek to achieve for our country. We've made major advancements in good governance. I don't want you to believe that we haven't made the type of advancements we have. America's led the world in good governance. I'm proud of an effort several years ago that I was successfully undertook with Senator Lugar. The two of us introduced the Transparency Initiative for mineral wealth of countries. For you see, some of the wealthiest countries in the world, particularly in Africa and some in Asia, some of the wealthiest mineral-rich countries in the world are some of the poorest countries in the world, because their resource becomes a curse rather than a blessing. It becomes a source for corruption, not a source for the economic empowerment of the people who live in that country where those resources are located. So a bill that we were able to get through Congress requires the extractive industry companies to list publicly their contracts with these countries so that you can trace the dollars to see whether they're in fact going to the people or going to corruption. Every company that's listed on our exchanges must follow that information. And guess what? Once the United States passed this law, Europe and Canada follow suit, passing identical laws. So now we cover most of the world, resource companies that now have to disclose their contracts, and it's making a major difference on dealing with corruption in these developing countries. Dr. Byrd mentioned the Magnitsky Law, and I'm going to mention it again. I actually gave one of the 8 speeches was on Magnitsky, so if you want to hear more about Magnitsky, this is all recorded. Go back and find the previous speech. But let me just talk about the Magnitsky Law for one moment because it's relevant. It's the law. It was passed 3 years ago. Senator McCain and I worked together to get that done. And the reason it's called Magnitsky is because it deals with an individual named Sergei Magnitsky. And let me tell you why we do that. There are millions of people who are suffering today because of the lack of good governance. There are many individuals who are in prison today. And I could give you the numbers, but if I give you the numbers, they're not going to mean anything to you. Unless we can personalize it, unless we can show a face, it's hard to get the type of action that we need. So Sergei Magnitsky was a 37-year-old lawyer who represented a client, discovered corruption, reported as a lawyer is required to his government. His government, because he reported that corruption, arrested him, tortured him, killed him. And the people who were responsible, and it was well documented, our State Department and Department of Treasury have documented the individuals who were responsible for his torture and death. They were promoted. So we passed a law that said in Russia, if you perpetrate these gross violations of human rights and you are not held accountable by your own government, you're not going to come to America. We're not going to give you the benefit of a visa to visit our country, to visit your wealth. And you're not going to use the American banking system in order to further your corrupt schemes. And that bill is now the law of the land. And there are many individuals from Russia that have been sanctioned under that law through independent judgment of the information made available. That's making a difference. Once again, U.S. leadership, Europe passed a similar law. Other countries have passed similar laws today. And it's very simple to avoid the sanctions. Russia should take action against those who have perpetrated these crimes. But if they don't, the international community will respond. Let me tell you one other really impressive accomplishment that we got in good governance. I'm very proud of this one. And that is last fall, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal is one that everyone should be aware of. Let me go back to the Millennium Development Goals that were created by the United Nations. They were created to make real progress on areas that we felt as global citizens we needed to advance. They deal with issues such as maternal health and gender equity issues on women and education. They deal with climate change. They deal with areas where we think we've got to come together as a community, as a world community, and work towards solutions and have achievable goals that we can achieve in a 10-year period or a 15-year period. And we did that, and we achieved those. We met our goals in most of these cases because it's not just the United Nations and its programs, it's the individual countries and their programs, and it's the NGO community and its private companies, all focused on a common agenda. And the second round, called the Millennium Development Goals, Goal 16 was passed after intense lobbying by leaders in our country. I was at the United Nations lobbying for this goal to be passed. Quite frankly, I was not optimistic it was going to happen because I know a lot of countries do not like international scrutiny on corruption. But we were able to get it done, and that goal requires building just, peaceful, and inclusive societies, promote rule of law at the national and international level to ensure access to justice for all while working to substantially reduce corruption, bribery, and develop effective, accountable, and transparent institutions. So we are now on record, and we will be engaging private companies to make sure that they don't participate in corruption. NGOs, so they don't pay in order to be able to get their mission accomplished in a country, bribes to government leaders, because that just makes our challenges that much greater. I am optimistic about that, but we still have a lot more work to be done, so let me just leave you with a few of my wish list things that we need to get accomplished. But first, I always tell you that there's no country that is perfect on this, including the United States. And if we are going to have credibility, we need to take care of our problems at home first on governance. And it's very appropriate for me to say I start with the way our election systems work in this country. You know, I got friends all over the world to come in and meet with me. They want to know how we do things so great in America. They want to copy our system. They come up from, we talk about, how we developed the great democratic institutions, our judiciary, all these. I said, don't copy the way we do our elections. Do yourself a favor. And yes, our nominating system for president is, in my view, badly flawed. Our campaign finance system is badly flawed and needs to be corrected. The fact that the people of the District of Columbia don't have full voting representation in the United States Congress is a disgrace and a violation of international human rights and needs to be corrected. The fact that you have people who have been sentenced to a prison term, they come out of prison, returning citizens, they can't vote, that's wrong. And of course, we have some fundamental problems in our criminal justice system that we have to take care of that we saw here in Baltimore and around the rest of the nation. I have some legislation to correct that. But our sentencing guidelines need to be changed because they discriminate against minorities. That has to be done. So we have a lot of things that we need to get done here in America. So don't lose sight as we talk foreign policy and good governance that America should be left off the table. There are things that we need to do here in America to take care of those issues. Some additional tools that we need for foreign policy. We're working on legislation, and it's bipartisan, and I hope to get it done in this Congress, that would create a corruption index of all the countries in the world so that you can take a look at one place, at a document,
and see how well every country in the world is doing on meeting international standards to fight corruption. We have a record on this on trafficking in persons, the TIP report, for those who are familiar. It is the gold standard for how countries are doing. And when a foreign leader comes in and meets with me, or I go to another country, I have that TIP report in front of me. And I can tell you, in Saudi Arabia, we were talking about, in Qatar, we're talking about how they're dealing with women and some of the issues. In Namibia, they were surprised that I brought it up, but after I brought it up, they were focused on it. So how they deal with labor in Qatar. They know about that report. And they're tiered, and if you get on the low tier and you don't correct yourself, there are penalties involved. So we want to do the same for corruption. Whether you have an independent prosecutor, whether it's properly funded, whether courts are independent, whether you have adequate laws on your books to deal with bribery. Those types of identifiable procedures to fight corruption and to have a similar tiered approach. That legislation is prepared to be filed very shortly, and we have certain commitments, we believe, from our colleagues on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to try to move that legislation in this Congress. You need accountability for actions. I mentioned that earlier, that President Assad of Syria should be in The Hague. I've introduced the Syrian War Crimes Act. We can't allow impunity. You can't allow people to commit atrocities and not hold them accountable. And we do that too often. So we need to have a better handle. And we need the Magnitsky Law made global. And that is, it shouldn't just apply to Russia, it should apply to all countries. And quite frankly, that bill, I think, has an excellent chance of enactment in this Congress. It's already passed the United States Senate. It's now in the House of Representatives, the global Magnitsky Law. The Washington Post yesterday came out with an editorial in support of it. I was glad to see that. They commented that it's a pragmatic way to deal with human rights violations, so we are optimistic that perhaps we can get that bill done. Let me just conclude by mentioning one other area that you're going to see a strong action by this senator. So if any of you are interested in becoming an ambassador, it's not a bad job, or you're going to come through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for confirmation, you better be prepared to talk about your commitment to good governance and human rights. We have now standardized the questions on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that deal with every ambassador nominee having to give us their game plan on how they're going to improve governance in the country that they represent the United States in, and how they're going to make periodic reports to us in dealing with that progress. We are committed to this agenda. I don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. I know I'm going to be in the next Congress of the United States, and I'm going to be raising these issues because I think the core mission for our foreign policy is to make sure that we focus on good governance. Now, I know the next president is going to have to deal with this. And I got a feeling that she and I are going to get along very well. But if we stick to that agenda, then we will be able to advance non-proliferation. We will be able to deal with sustainable economies. We will be able to deal with the next pandemic that comes along, that we have a government structure that can deal with this in a much more cost-effective way, that we will be able to deal with issues such as climate change in a much more aggressive way. All that depends upon building the frameworks of good governance. You all know the numbers. You know how much money we spend on our military. It's the largest budget we have at the national level. We spend less than 1% of our federal budget on diplomacy and development assistance. And we spend a very, very, very small fraction of that on good governance. Algene may have the specific numbers, but it is a small amount that we invest in governance. And it can save us a great deal of resources and can make our foreign policy that much more effective. I'm optimistic that we will make progress on these issues. And as I look around this room, seeing so many people here, You give me energy, and you give me reason to be optimistic. If you all are here tonight, interested when there's a Yankee game in town, you're here. I think it does give me great hope. It's a real honor to represent you in the United States Senate. Thank you all very much.
The senator has agreed to answer questions. He'll call upon you and repeat the questions.
Sure. Yes. The question is, I missed one topic, and that's the subject of Iran. Iran, we spent a lot of time on Iran. Iran's a very dangerous country. It is a country that I can tell you that the moderate Gulf states, all they talk about is Iran. They are very concerned about Iran's interference in Yemen, Iran's interference in Syria, Iran's interference in Libya. They believe that Iran intentionally is trying to cause governments to lack stability so that there's a friction, and therefore extremists have an opening. Iran, of course, also directly supports terrorist organizations through their funds. So I think your question is probably aimed at the Iran nuclear agreement. Okay. I strongly supported a diplomatic solution to the Iran nuclear agreement. I thought we could have done better than what was negotiated by the president. I am doing everything I possibly can to make sure that the president is proven correct and that this agreement is enforced, Iran never becomes a nuclear weapon state, and that we continue to focus on Iran on their other type of activities, including ballistic missiles, support of terrorism, and human rights violations. And I am working with the White House and with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to try to make sure we have effective policies that deal with Iran in compliance with the nuclear agreement, but also dealing with their other activities. But today, Iran is causing significant problems in Syria, significant problems in Libya, significant problems in Yemen. And I'm sure there'll be other countries that'll be involved. But we do believe that we can do more than one thing at a time with Iran, and we'll continue to do that. Yes, sir. All right. The question is, what is the status of the Middle East, of the Israel-Palestinian peace process? There's only one way forward between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's only one way forward, and that's two states living side by side. That's the only solution that's available. And there's been no greater proponent of that than Secretary of State John Kerry. He is totally fluent on every aspect of it. I have met with him numerous occasions. I have met with him where after a couple hours I said, John, don't you think we should take a break? He is very intense on this, and he'll never give up. I can tell you that. He's not going to give up. But even John Kerry would tell you, got to wait for the right moment, and now is not the right time. And we could argue whose fault it is or whatever. It's certainly not the United States' fault. It's certainly not the Obama administration's fault. But this is not the right time. So to me, the most important thing is to keep hope alive and to keep the violence down. And what I am promoting and working with both the Israelis and the Palestinians is whether we can find an avenue forward for enforcing the security arrangements, particularly in Gaza and lesser extent in the West Bank, because they have a pretty good security force in the West Bank, and that there's real economic opportunity for the Palestinians, including the development of Gaza. And we are looking at trying to advance both of those aims now, because we do believe, quite frankly, the two-state and the parameters of the two states and all the other issues are not as challenging to resolve once we get the parties together, as long as there is peace and there's economic opportunity. So that's what we're trying to do until there's an opportunity. Let me look this way. I've never been accused of looking too far to the right, but let me look to the left here. Yes. The question is, talk about having an end game before we use our military. The United States doesn't have a long, successful track record of nation building. So how do you intend to really bring that out? So let me sort of disagree with you about nation building or government building. I think we have democracy funds. We deal with health care, and we deal with food supply. We deal with judiciary. We do deal in our foreign assistance with building up the institutions of democracy. It's not the U.S. system. These are global. We never expect these countries are going to look like us when they're finished. Don't get me wrong. And there are times where you can't use that as a prerequisite to entering. If there's an immediate risk against our country, we have to take action. And that is, any commander-in-chief needs to be able to do that. But if you are deciding to come in where you have a conflict that is brewing and that you can use the military to get rid of the problems why that country can't have stability, you need a game plan to finish it. And we didn't do that in Libya. As a result, the government in the capital was one that was discredited even by us. So it was that you shouldn't be in that position. You need to be able to figure that out before you go in. And yes, I think we do have the tools. It's not going to be just the United States. That's why coalition building is important. Quite frankly, you look at the countries that are the best suited to be able to help the emerging country develop the democratic institutions that you're trying to do. So, we look to Jordan. Jordan's not a perfect democracy by any stretch of the imagination. It's not at all. But they have a lot of good things going on in Jordan. So we use their people on certain aspects of, for example, military training and developing an opposition. King Abdullah met with me to determine how to have a successful opposition party in Jordan. Why? He didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood. He wanted to have a more mainstream opposition. Smart. So those are the things that we work on collectively. There's a lot of areas we didn't cover, but the principles are all the same. And that is, America's strength is not in its military alone. We have the strongest military, but our strength are in our ideals. It's what we stand for. It's what we stand for globally that has brought America the strength that it has and the credibility it has. And why so many countries would rather do business with the United States than Russia or China or any of those other countries. They trust us, and it's because of our ideals. And when we deviate from our ideals, when someone says that if you're Muslim, you can't come to the United States, that weakens America. That weakens America because it tarnishes our ideals. And that's what I'm going to be fighting for. That's going to be what I hope the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will be standing strong with the next administration to make sure America's ideals remain strong and America remains strong for the sake not only of our own security, but for the global peace and security. Thank you all very much.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. You don't have to agree with Senator Cardin to be delighted with his role in public office. Let me add that with respect to Europe, we will have the ambassador of the European Union to the United States on June 15th.